perspective on what happens to emergency managers, a professionalization of the field, if you will. This idea that we can't have the one person, it's got to be a collaborative effort. So all of this idea of having a plan, a management structure in place ties into those things. And this idea of the governance structure, that those 4 elements that we'll be talking about here, this idea of a coordinator or committee, some way of administering the program and evaluation on an ongoing basis. And then these 2 organizations play a heavy role in making these things happen and providing the framework for it to happen. As with most things that you deal with, a lot of the success of any plan, it depends on those early decisions that are made as you're starting to set it up from day one. And your book goes at great length in talking about these things. But one is a relationship between the chief executive officer and the emergency program manager. So some of the challenges that get involved with that, your text suggests that the closer the emergency manager is to the administration of the organization, the better they are positioned to be able to talk about things. But it also mentions that they have to be a standalone organization. Okay, and that's where the obvious caveat, small organization, you can't really have those things. But you need to have that kind of a relationship in an organizational structure, lines of authority. So physically not so much is important, but just organizationally having a linkage between emergency managers and the chief administrative officer, chief executive officer are important. You've got to have that ability to come in and talk like any other department head would be, even though you may just be one person who's coordinating. What you also find is sometimes as we talk, they will be placed within fire or police or EMS as the location of it. And that has structural advantages short term because you have immediate relationship and contact with the emergency response teams, right? Those would be first responders in the case. But if it's not set up and it's seen as a subset of the fire chief or the police chief or the sheriff, that can sometimes damage that very first issue, which what's that nature of the relationship. Okay? And all of this goes back to things we've talked about earlier. One of the big differences between emergency management, emergency preparedness in the public and the private sector is that in the private sector, the boss says do as it happens. In the political sector, you've got budgets, you've got other politics, which is what this next point talks about, that it has to be outside the political structure of the organization. You cannot have your emergency manager caught up in the politics of the day, because then you're making decisions on emergency response from political positions, not from best practices position. And what might be an example of how you might get caught into the political structure of the organization? Funding might be one way that it gets involved. So you want to get them out of that debate about personalities and whatnot. It's about the function. So budgeting is a key area where you want to make sure you're out of that political process and that it's evaluated on its own. What's another very common complaint about first responders and which cases they choose to take? That's going on right now with this young woman who was found in Utah, missing persons. What's one of the big issues going now with missing persons? An attractive white female is more likely to get more attention than a minority, right? The publicity and the resources are oftentimes addressed based on perception of value or whatnot. And so too often, if you get sucked into the politics, you can get into, well, who's called, you answer first. The rich section that has minimal damage or the less rich section that has more important damage. Right? And so we have to be able to draw that line because oftentimes, take an instance in New Orleans after Hurricane Ida, there were large areas were without electricity, right? What was one of the first areas that got restored? Pardon me? It's a two-word city, who's also known as NO. New Orleans, yeah. They got their power restored quickly. Now, and then places like Laplace and those other more rural areas are still fighting for electricity. And you've got to understand that that's not basically a political decision, it's a matter of who has the resources. It's much easier from an economy of scale to respond to a citywide blackout than it is to respond to a blackout in a predominantly rural area where things are more spread apart. So you have to make those decisions based on, rational objectives. Yeah, we could do more good for more people by working with the city, plus they have a more compact, consolidated system, right? As opposed to going out rural areas where you may be a half a mile between houses. Does that make sense? Pardon me? Yeah, and so again, we have to understand that you've got to be able to make these on practical, realistic assessments of response, not on political considerations. And then you have to be able to defend why you do those things. You hear that all the time, why does the response tend to be varied? So again, outside the politics, so budgets, respond, who gets responses first, things of that nature get to be an important element of what we talk about to go through. And again, your text talks in much more detail about these things. So one of the things that we talk about is this idea of having an advisory committee. And the purpose of the advisory committee is to do what? Advise, absolutely, right? And so the more people you have at the table, the broader the perspectives, the more diversity you have in perspectives, and the better you are able to have a more broad-based response to emergencies and emergency management. So identifying key stakeholders and having them at the table gets to be critically important. And what is a stakeholder? Not necessarily something to do, but somebody that has a stake in what you're doing. Okay, so obviously the people with things to lose has a stake, so the communities themselves have a stake. But who also has a role or a stake, an investment in what emergency response does? People who fund it, utility companies, fire, police, emergency response. And we talked about the new big category of groups that start with a V, followed by an O. Volunteer organizations, right? Red Cross, things of that. So Red Cross and the Cajun Navy and church groups and all those kind of things all have a stake because they have a role to play in the emergency response. And what this suggests is the more of those folks you have at the table, the better you're going to get a more diverse attitude and approach to see what resources are available. And the problem that happens oftentimes with advisory committees, if you're not careful, you pick those players who are more likely to agree with what you want to do, right? Because it makes it easier. When in fact, in the selection, if it's done well, it provides this broad perspective. And by having those folks at the table, that immediately gives you access to what they have to offer, right? It's much easier to bring those folks in at the beginning of the debate, the beginning of the discussion, the planning, than afterwards say, oh, by the way, would you mind helping out? So this idea of collaboration. So in setting up this advisory committee, those are the other things that get to be very important in moving toward the process. And putting together that committee is critically important. In your text, I would pay attention to pages 96 and 97, where they have two models and that basically have different ways of presenting the same types of information. And what they do in both of these is they have a process by which you clearly identify who the decision makers are and who are the advisory people. And why is that important to make a distinction between whether you're advisory or decision making? Okay, accountability obviously falls to the people who have ultimate decision making possibility. How many of you have ever asked for your input and they say thanks and then disregard it? Has that ever happened to you? Yeah, does that make you feel like you're an important part of the group, or kind of, they don't care?
Not important.
Huh?
Not important.
Yeah, not important. So what this suggests is you set that out early. You let people know that their role is advisory. We're going to get information from a lot of sources, and we appreciate that information, but ultimately that has to be filtered through, and you are advisory, not the ultimate decision making, right? And if you clearly lay that out up front, you see a lot of that in government and non-for-profits with the structure of boards. Right? Most organizations have a governing board of some type. And the problem is that in a governmental or not-for-profit and public environment, there are four broad categories. You have some that are governing bodies. They're designed to govern the organization. So one of the best examples from a public perspective would be library commissions, library committees. In South Carolina, the requirement for each county to have its own library or participate in a regional library predates the Home Rule Act of '74, so they carried forth that authority. So they basically hired the librarian and set up and coordinate with council for funding and things. So they're a pure governing body. Others are simply advisory, like planning commissions, architectural review boards, right? They are advisory. They gather information and provide information input to the council, who makes the ultimate decision. Okay. A third role that they play are what's known as quasi-judicial. They are judicial in the extent that they enforce the ordinances that are created by who? The council. So they're quasi-judicial and they enforce what council has approved, but they don't have the authority to independently modify or change it without the approval of council. And then you have another fourth kind, which are kind of special purpose, that deal a lot with not-for-profit or fundraising efforts on behalf of other organizations. So this committee structure is important, and these elements are true in all of those. In Figure 5.1, it talks about you can have work groups, stakeholder committee, steering committee, and the policy committee. And given that structure, who are the decision makers? You can look at the concentric circles to get a sense of that. Who's at the center of the circle? Policy groups, right? So in this structure, you have work groups, and those, so we'll work at it backwards. The way that might structure is you start a policy committee. Okay, this is the core committee we've got of our emergency management, our chief executive officer, and our major EMS, hypothetically, okay? So they'll go out and say, well, we need to have a group that we'll call the steering committee, and their job is to go out and kind of help guide us through the process and identify and select people who they want to participate in the process. So then they go and look at stakeholders, who are the major key, EMS, fire, Red Cross, volunteer organizations. And then those organizations would go further out and get people with technical expertise from that organization to work as in a work group. And so you may have one group who's going to look at the best way for fire suppression. You may have another group that looks at community considerations. You may have another group, that looks at utilities. Okay, so there are a variety of folks. There are subsets, if you will, of stakeholders, but they're people who have interest in that broad area. Their job as a work group is to look over things, find what's going on, and report back to the stakeholder committee, who then reviews all of these alternatives. And then the steering committee, and then back to the policy committee. Okay. So in that structure, the policy committee is the ultimate decision making, but all these other circles play an important role. Okay. Because it's back to this idea in the broad sense of the emergency manager has lots of responsibility, but they have neither the time nor the resources to do everything that's expected of them, right? It's unrealistic to expect that an organization in and of itself would have all the resources needed to respond to a disaster. And so you broaden out from there to get those people involved. So the other model, which comes from, and you'll see this term a couple times, is, I don't know whether it's fire scope or fire's cope. I don't know how it's supposed to be pronounced. But it's this, I love it. Acronyms are amazing the way we put these things together. Firefighting Resources of Southern California Organized for Potential Emergencies. Did they come up with an abbreviation that thought it'd be cool to start with and then got words to match? I had it right, but anyway. So they're another group that put together, and so their model is very similar, except what they do in their model is they specify the folks that are bold are the major decision makers, and the people that are not in bold are the ones that are advisory in nature, provide input. The difference here is they identify those particular groups. But it's this notion of, one, making sure there's no confusion over who are the decision makers. And you all have probably experienced in some way or another, one of the greatest sources of conflict in any organization is the confusion over roles and responsibilities. Who's doing what? And so what this suggests is, from this committee structure, it's 9:43, so just trying to help you out. How's that for paying attention to my student needs? Yeah, we'll see when you get back. So the structure gets to be important in who you have come to the table and making sure everybody knows what their role is, whether it's advisory, support, or whether it's decision-making roles. So again, these are two different models. They're structured somewhat differently, but fundamentally they're the same, right? You've got the key decision makers, and then you've got all the ancillary supports that go forward to move on from that. TAT, this fire scope, or fire scope, the firefighter guys, they have it set up into a task force that provides analysis and support, and then specialist groups that provide technical staff work. Again, terminology, but it's basically the same as the other. And then the other component that they have is a board of directors, a coordinator, and operations team. And again, they're just titles, and so titles are less important than making sure the functions get done. So this board of directors that they have with the California equates basically to the policy committee that's in the other model, right? They're the ones that are the key policy makers, the decision makers, and they have to make sure everything goes well. They have the coordinators, who are a management team responsible to the board. In this case, it could be the steering committees, who's responsible to the board on how the program is being managed and moved forward. And then you have the operations teams, which spell out on the other term is this idea of stakeholders and work groups. So again, it's this layered approach with different responsibilities and what they have to do. So don't get hung up so much on terminology. From a test perspective, it'd be much easier to talk about the advisory committee organization from Figure 5.1 than to try to do it from Figure 5.2. Is that a good enough clue? Hopefully that's it. Hopefully, yeah. So look at those things. Again, the functions are the same, the terms are somewhat different in what they do. So we talked about this idea that you have to have a plan in place, that what you have to do in this new, changing, evolving world is not just tell me, but have documentation. And your text puts that under the broad rubric of an administrative plan. And the administrative plan, according to the NFPA 1600 and EMAP that we talked about earlier, has these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 elements that needs to be included. The first one is the authority and the scope. What does that mean? Authority and scope.
I guess the leaders and what their plans are.
Partly. But in general terms, if I give you authority, what is that? What am I giving you?
Giving us
power, right? What powers do you have? What authorities do you have? What support do you have to do these things? So you've given the authority to make this happen. So authority and power is a good way to look at that relationship. And then what is scope? Yes, I know it's a mouthwash, but that's not what we're talking about here, right? What's the scope?
Would it be the extent to which you have power?
Yeah, the areas over which you have power. What's the functional area or the geographic area over which you have that power? So you have to define in there what are the actual authorities that you have, what are the powers you have to make this happen, and what's the scope, what's the operating environment in which you operate, right? And that needs to be clearly spelled out to go on. Vision and mission, we've talked a little bit about that, and when we get to strategic planning, this idea of vision and mission gets to be critically important. And previously we talked about that. So what is a vision for an organization?
What you set out to do with your organization?
Kind of, sort of. A bit more specific than that would be nice.
Is the ideal
What do you want to do when you get out of college?
I want to be a lawyer.
You want to be a lawyer. So that's your vision. That's what you want to achieve. That's so, Aiden, your point is exact, but it's a broader scope than that. It's what do I want to be when I grow up? If I were to leave in 10 years and come back, what would I like my life to look like? But it's from an organizational perspective. And it's one of the key roles of leaders is to keep the vision in front of the organization, to keep them focused on the vision. Okay. So if that's your vision, what's your mission?
To get to law school.
Get to law school, yeah, right? You need to graduate, get your undergraduate degree. You've got to get a high enough good grade point average to be competitive. You've got to have outside activities, to demonstrate you're more than just a joiner. You actually have an active role to play in those organizations, right? You have to do well on the LSAT. All of those things. I'm not trying to scare you, but it's already things you've talked about, right? And so you want to get those things, and that's your mission, because then that's what gets you into law school. And then law school, you've got your mission to do there, right? You need to do well in the classes, pick classes that either support the area you want to go into or help you decide what area you want to go into. And then you want to have activities, again, that enhance the vitae when you go out and look at law review or other kinds of things like that to achieve that ultimate goal and ultimate vision of becoming an attorney. And then you have another vision that comes into that, right? What do I want to achieve based on that? So this is simply taking what we do in our everyday lives, what do I want to be when I grow up, and if I ever figure that out, I'm in trouble. I just have too much fun doing what I'm doing. But what's your vision? Where do you want to be? What do you want to look like? What do you want to achieve? What do you want to accomplish? What do you want to be known for? This is the vision. And the mission is then, how do I get there? What's my job in making that vision come true? And organizations have to have that. And too often they get very wordy in the process because it sounds more impressive, but it's just very straightforward. What do you want to achieve? What do you want to accomplish? And then what is your job in making that happen? That plan has to have those things in place. Membership. What we've already talked about from a committee structure, but why is membership important? Need people, but more specifically, what does the Red Cross do for us? Why do we want the Red Cross involved in any emergency response or emergency plan? They can help us recover because they have certain skill sets, right? They have people that are trained to go in ahead of disasters. They have resources pre-positioned to go in, right? Why would we want to have church groups involved? There's a lot of church groups, right? Send groups out to help clean up and whatnot afterwards. other volunteer groups. So membership goes back to who you want to have on those steering committees, who you want to have on those committees that make things happen, right? So again, membership is key. Who do you include in your organization that are key stakeholders to help you determine and make the best plan possible? So membership ties in there. Structure. Why is structure important?
That's basically just a hierarchy, right?
Yeah, the structure is a hierarchy, how you're organized, what your lines of authority are within the organization, how those link out to outside who have an active role to play. Okay. So that organizational structure. Relationships. Pretty soon these things ought to be pretty much repetitive to what we've been talking about so far, right? Who do you have a relationship with and why is that important? Yeah, collaboration, absolutely. Again, all these should start fitting in from what we've talked about up to this point, is this idea that membership and structure talk about who's going to be at the table, who's going to be an active participant in what goes on, and what is the nature of the structure of the organization itself, and then those relationships to organizations that are not part of your formal structure. Red Cross is a relationship that you should be developing. Right? Volunteer groups, food pantries, whatever they might be, are all in this nature of relationships. And strategic planning is the section that we'll talk about after this. And what strategic planning talks about is how do we make it happen. And we talk about linkage, which we'll get more to as we go in. So we have the authority. What powers do we have? What's our operating environment? You know, the extent of what we're responsible for. What's our vision and mission for us as an emergency management team organization? Who do we have at the table when we put together the plan? Who are the active stakeholders that get to be important to know about? What's our organizational structure, our lines of authority, our hierarchy, or however that might be? What's the nature of our relationships with organizations that are not within our formal organizational structure? Decision making, how do decisions get made? Who's the ultimate decision maker? Is the ultimate decision maker the emergency manager? Or is the ultimate decision maker the political body? The key is that you have that spelled out within your administrative plan. And then you may want to go in and divide decision making into tactical and strategic. And you may want to have a structure such that the emergency manager, the emergency management team, is responsible for the strategic responses. And those best capable have tactical responsibilities. So fire and EMS and law enforcement and whatnot, they could be more tactical, more event-specific focused. But however you want to have that done, and all of this idea of authority and scope applies to everything within the organization. People have to know the extent of their authority and the limits of their authority. Because what gets us most in trouble is somebody who takes their authority much too seriously and jumps into areas over which they have no responsibility. That can cause conflict, right? And that's why we talked about early on with the response from Team Rubicon and from the Cajun Navy, specifically after Hurricane Ida, is that they both had a seat at the table in emergency operations to make sure their group, their teams, were in concert, if you will, with the rest of the efforts. All that ties into the decision making. Funding. And funding comes from a variety of sources, although we're not going to talk a great deal about it. Your book talks nice about grants and the grant process, because a lot of the equipment and in some ways a lot of the training are available to be supported by or completely funded through grants from different organizations. Right? So understanding the grant process, understanding how to write grants, the vocabulary. Some organizations will even have a grants writer that their positions to go out and find grants and submit reports. So funding has a variety of sources. from the organization, from an ongoing effort, from grants that are available to help specific efforts, specific activities that go on. And then as a disaster spreads, you have state and federal funding that's available. But you have to know all that up front and have those sources identified so that when a disaster happens, when you have to implement your plan, you already know who your resources are. You already know who your funding alternatives are. So you don't have to waste time searching. And it's that idea that the best time to do all this stuff is when you don't need to do it. When things are quiet and peaceful and normal. Then you can put your plans, and you can expand your plans to make sense. You know, meetings. What kind of meetings you're going to have? How often you're going to have meetings? Are there going to be public access to your meetings? Are there going to be informational meetings? How are they going to be structured? How are they going to be led? Right? How often? All those issues get involved because part of your job as emergency management is not only to help prepare the organization for response, it's also to help prepare the community. Knowing where evacuation centers are, knowing what resources are available, knowing what ports of contact are for missing persons. And all that can be done through a combination of meetings and then communication. And communication can be both internal and external. Internal being how you communicate within the organization and your partners. And external, how do you deal with the news media? How do you deal with getting information out to the public in a meaningful way? And it's great to have cell phone notifications, except when? When the towers are down, you can't communicate with anybody. Right? How are you going to get the information out if your source or if your method of contact isn't available? What's going to be the alternative? Are you going to have regional areas set up that are going to coordinate for that sense of community? Or are you going to have major people set up at evacuation centers to share? How are you going to structure that, right? And all that needs to be thought about before you need to put it in place, and that's why you do the exercises. And that's why you do, when we talk about evaluation, and the easiest way to look at it is the old military acronym for after action reports. You always need to spend some time looking at what worked and what didn't work after an event that's actual or an event that's an exercise. Because that's how you learn the lessons. And we do that all the time, evaluation. We don't necessarily look at it in that formal way, but when we drive, we evaluate our driving. What's the easiest way to get there? Where are the speed traps? Where are the areas I need to avoid, right? Where's the next gas station? So all of that is that information you build up, and some of it you think about beforehand, but other kind of stuff you think about afterwards. Well, I could have done this, I should have done that. So these terms that we're using in the structure should not be foreign to any of us because we all do that. You know? And so evaluations are numbers of ways. You can have outside people come in. The good news and bad news about using external actors, the good news is they're external. They're not involved in the politics of whatnot that the organization has going for us. So that can be an advantage, right, in doing an assessment. They have no vested interest in anybody winning or losing. The downside is oftentimes they don't understand the organizational structure. They don't understand the personalities of various groups. So evaluation in your text talks a lot about that, and we'll talk a bit more about that as we go through the strategic planning process. Okay? But this plan is a way that you document based on emergency manager accrediting and whatnot, and the fire service, right? Look at those things as you go forward. Questions on those? Again, your text goes at greater length in talking about some of these things to move forward. Have any of you gone through programs or sessions where they talked about goal setting and what goals are? Did you ever use the acronym SMART goals? What are SMART goals?
I don't remember the exact acronym.
Pardon me?
I just saw it yesterday.
Pardon me?
I just saw it yesterday.
You don't know how good it makes me feel when you guys can't remember what you saw yesterday. It gives me a lot of hope. There are things that are known as mnemonic devices. They help us remember things. So, how many of you know the names of the Great Lakes? Pardon me? Holmes is a good mnemonic device. H-O-M-E-S. Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, Superior. They're mnemonic devices that help us remember. So, SMART goals is a mnemonic device to help remember these stages. Right? The first thing is they have to be specific. I don't want to be better, it's where do I want to be better? Right? What's the specifics we have in there that we're trying to accomplish? So SMART, S means specific. M means can you measure them? How will you know? So I don't want to get better next year, I want to have 5 more cases. I want to have 15% more increase. Have a specific measurement that you can use, and that measurement becomes a goal that you can track to see what progress you're being made. And planning and goal setting are just that. They are plans. They are objectives you're trying to achieve, and you always have to keep in mind that there may be external factors that prevent you from doing that. Right? So you want to hire X number of people, and then you run into the COVID situation. The fact that you weren't able to hire the number of people you said, does that mean you failed? Not if there's an external happening that you had no control over. So that's why, having a specific, M being measurable. A means achievable. They have to be able to be achieved. The R stands for realistic. What's the difference between achievable and realistic?
Try to do something in like 6 months. Like realistically, it's like you might have to pull that number down a little bit more.
Hayden?
I was gonna say that you can just make a goal that you can achieve, but realistically, the chances of you achieving it could be less than like a percentage.
Yeah. So the example I use is I want to run a 4-minute mile. Okay, is that achievable? Yeah, there are people that run a 4-minute mile or so. Now be nice here because I'm a very sensitive person. Is that realistic for me to set that as a goal?
It can't be. You put in the word.
Yeah, but see, that's the difference, right? Yeah, it's theoretically achievable, back to what you just said, Aiden, right? But how realistic is it going to happen? And there are a lot of variables at work. So understanding there's that difference. So they have to be achievable, but also have to be realistic. And there's, and then the T stands for time. So a SMART goal in terms of what I just said that fails one of the patterns is I want to be specific. I want to run a 5.5 minute mile. That's right. Okay, that's specific. Measurable, yeah, I can check whether I've met that time limit, right? Is it achievable, realistic? Well, we just dealt with those issues. But I have time, so I want to be able to achieve this by January of 2023. So that way, that allows you to have an end date that you're working toward, gives you time and flexibility to implement stages to make it happen. Gives you times along the way to measure your progress toward achieving it, and then on that date, you can go back and see whether you actually achieved the goal. So, and I go through that every time I work with organizations and do strategic planning, and we talk about goal setting. You got to have those elements, otherwise it's not meaningful. If it doesn't have a time frame, who cares if you do it or not? If you can't measure success, so those are critical elements that go through. And there you have to be able to evaluate. And so again, if you don't have that measurement element in your goal, how are you going to evaluate whether it's successful or not? How will you know what success is? Okay. So very, very common elements that fit in. So some of the elements, and we've talked about these before, you'll see these in place, this idea of a vision and a mission. Now your text doesn't talk about this, but some organizations are moving in the direction of also having value statements. Statements of what are important to us, what, honesty, integrity, accountability. So some will have not only a vision and a mission, but also will include a statement of values, what's important to them. Okay. Need to have long-term objectives, and those are usually 3 to 5 years. It's amazing how little most of us have these long-term goals and objectives. And again, the difference between a goal and objective. A goal is a broad definition. The objectives are specific elements that you have to address to make it happen. And so the objectives is where the strategic notion of strategic planning comes in. This is the goal that I want to achieve. I've defined it in that element that gives me what I need to have. Okay, now what steps do I need to take to get us to that point? And figure 5.4 on page 102 shows you a model for the way those things happen. And links together. We're just kind of putting it in a different concept. So you're going to have these long-term goals that say in 3 to 5 years, because some things you want to accomplish take a bit more time. But then you want to have an annual goal. These are the things I want to achieve this year. And usually by those annual goals, there are many different ways to define annual. One of the most common ways to have annual goals is to set it consistent with your budget cycle, with the idea of fiscal years. And some fiscal years are 1 July to 30 June, some are 1 October to 30 September, and others they go by the calendar year. But one of the easiest ways to do that is to link it to your budget cycle, to your budget year, because it takes money to accomplish most of these things, right? And some will be multi-year, but if you do it consistent with your fiscal year, it just makes it easier for implementation, easier for funding, easier to set a plan in place. Within those goals, then you have the individual's objectives. So I want to have a good training program as my goal. So my program, my objective may be this year, I want to have 17 more online training opportunities available for all of my students and have them up and running by the 30th of September. Right, that's got all those elements that are in there. And then within that, okay, fine, I need to contact vendors. I need to make sure we have the technology available. I need to make sure we have the resources available. I need to make sure I have somebody identified who's going to coordinate these things. So does it help you understand the difference between goals and objectives? The goal is a broad thing, and the objectives are those subsets that you need to accomplish to make things happen. You need to have this done, this done, this done. And that's where the strategy comes in, how we make those things happen. And then budgets. Some plans require, and I've seen this in a variety of different ways, at a minimum, what are the implications for this program we want to implement? Primarily, what's it going to cost? And after deciding what's going to cost, how we're going to pay for it. Are there grants available to help pay for it? Do we need to set this up as a fee for service? One of the things that I've been advocating for organizations for training is use their excess capacity in their training rooms and market their program to other organizations similar to theirs that also need training. You can avoid duplication of effort, and then you can charge them a flat rate to come in and do the training as a way to help pay for it. And so that budget implications are what that talks about. What's it going to cost and how we're going to pay for it. So this idea of strategic planning is a way to set both short and long-term goals for the organization for your emergency planning. And that's especially true when you're early, especially if it's a brand new effort. If you're shifting away from the old tactical event-focused planning to the more professional managerial style, okay, we want to have this in place by what date? In order to get it done by that date, we need to have these milestones along the way. We need to have an advisory committee, right? And You structure all those things out early on. I'm working with a group in the county that's a brand new group, and we talked about the importance of getting this done quickly, but well, in order to move forward. Because the old line is, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And strategic planning allows you to set up that roadmap for the organization, what it is you're trying to accomplish and what you're trying to move forward with. Strategic planning is critically important. Okay, pages 104 and 105 in your text give you a couple examples. Case study 5.1. Have any of you seen the movie A Bridge Too Far? It's a World War II movie based on this idea of Operation Market Garden, which is a way to secure bridges in order to be able to facilitate Allied advance through Germany. And so that's what this case study is about. It gives you the vision, the mission, the strategy, the goals, the objectives, which is a nice one-page or page-and-a-half look at all the things you just talked about. The vision is destroy armed forces. The mission sees crossing the river to make sure they can get there. Strategy, use 2 separate coordinated assaults. Goals, capture. Objectives, the specific bridges they want to accomplish and who's going to be responsible for it. Okay. So all those elements just talked about put up here are nice. This fire scope has got another brief set of how to do, what's their vision and mission and what it is they're trying to accomplish. So there is many formats for doing strategic planning as there are people who do strategic planning. But they all have to include those same elements. Some idea of establishing or reinforcing the vision, establishing and reinforcing the mission, identifying long-term goals, identifying the objectives within those goals that need to be met to assure accomplishment, setting a time frame for evaluation, and then linking it back to the vision. These will be different terminology, but those are the key elements that have to be there. I also, when I do my strategic planning, include the term SWOT analysis, S-W-O-T analysis. Have you ever heard the expression SWOT analysis? Help me out here.
Strengths, weaknesses, go with the A of the T's.
It's OT. SWAT, S-W-A-T, is a military or armed forces.
Go with the OT steps.
Yeah. SWAT teams are what? Special weapons, action teams, or whatever, assault teams. But SWOT, S-W-O-T, are strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. SWOT analysis. What are the strengths of the organization? What are the weaknesses of the organization? What are the opportunities that are available to enhance the organization? And what are the threats? Being from the country, I prefer to call it seeing what's out there. Right? Same point of view. What's the environment in which you're operating? What do you have going for you good? And the problem with strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats is that sometimes a strength can be a weakness. I have a strong management team, right? That's a strength. But how can that be a weakness? Too much leadership. They're too set in their ways. Right? So a strength can also be a weakness. But that's kind of one of the traditional things that a lot of strategic planning processes involve at some point on the stage to go through. But again, these are 2 examples that I would read through, although a question likely to come, I would be more likely to talk about case study 1 than I would the fire scope thing. Is that a clue? I try to be thoughtful. Okay. Because it gives a real world example that most of us can relate to in some way or the other. And the key takeaway there is it was an opportunity to show how planning works. What are we trying to accomplish? What's our job in getting us there? Right? What strategies are we going to use? How are we going to do it? What are our goals and what are our objectives?
That's the military bridge.
Yeah. Yeah, case study 5.1. It's on page 104 on the top of 105. And again, that's a great example. If asked to give a brief description of a good strategic plan, that provides all the elements, which is an important part of what we need to be doing and talking about. Okay. Goals should be linked to this notion of linkages that we talked about. We talked about SMART goals, this notion that objectives are a subset of goals that go through. And then figure 5.7 on page 107 gives you some sense of linkage and or evaluation. Does it support the mission? Will it help attain an objective? Does it conform to the policies? Is it measurable? Is it simple and easily understood? Can one person be made responsibility? Is it challenging but attainable? Another structure to make sure that your goals are set in such a way they can be evaluated. And this is just a bit more of a wordy version of that. Okay, I'm not going to take the time to go through these on page 110 and 111, starting at the bottom of 110. It lists 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 legislative authorities. I would be more than willing to wager you will have an opportunity to be able to talk about 2 of them. Charlotte, does that help? Okay, right. So, I mean, there are a lot of read through and be aware, because again, a lot of the things that you do have to have some statutory authority. And these are some of the more common ones. I would not ask you to list all of them, but a fair game is talk about any 2 of them, which should help you as you go through to prepare for things. The other thing your text talks about is this idea of grants and best practices. Grants are simply external funding availability. And grants always have to be written in the guidelines provided by the person providing the money. But they're a great way to get money for training, for equipment, for those kinds of things where grant monies are available. Best practices, from a business perspective, have you heard the term best practices? Yeah? Aiden, what's best practices?
I mean, it's basically what it sounds like. You try to put in the best plan of action for everything.
Okay, and how do you figure out best practices?
Test everything.
Pardon me?
Test everything.
No, it's much more fundamental than that. What's the old line? If you want to become a millionaire, hang around millionaires. Right? Because they're going to be the better ones to give you what you need to do to be successful. Best practices means look at those organizations that are successful, that have a good reputation. What do they do? How do they deal with that situation? And try to whatever extent possible implement it at your own level. So this idea of best practices are basically practices that are best, and you learn that by looking at other organizations who have a good reputation, have a good record, to be able to make those things happen. Okay. It talks about, again, for running your program as managing your resources, which we've talked about in a variety of ways. Training. Training is one of those ideas that comes under the concept is how can you hold people accountable for doing things you haven't told them how to do. Right? I'll give you a new piece of equipment here, make it happen, but I don't give you any training on how to use it. I don't know what the ON/OFF button is for. So training is ongoing, not only when you get new things, but again, best practices may mean you want to change the way you do things. So training is an important element no matter where you go. And then financing, how are we going to pay for all this, is an incredible component of what we do. And finally, this notion of evaluation comes up in a variety of different ways. We've already talked about the difference between qualitative and quantitative, so you have a sense of that. We've talked about exercises and the importance of running exercises that try to implement parts of your plan to see how well they worked. We have, for lack of a better term, after-action reports. How do you assess when things happen, what you did good, what you did bad? And the next section that we're talking about takes risk assessment, and that's what they do all the time. When an accident happens, what caused it? What can we do to... So risk assessment is basically a subset of emergency management. And then corrective action plans. What are you going to do? How are you going to correct it? What steps are you going to take? So these allow you immediately after an event the opportunity to go back and see what worked well, reinforce that. What didn't work, how can I make it work better? And if this just blew up in our face, how can I correct that error? So it's this idea that it's a continuous process all the way through. It's very cyclical in what we do. We set it up, we design it, we use these elements as part of who it is. We practice it to see if it works, how well our responses are. We then evaluate that exercise to see what worked well, what didn't work, how could we make it better next time. And then when a disaster comes, everything we put in place, okay, now let's look back at it. What worked well, what worked poorly, what could we do better? And then that just cycles all the way through. Then that may need to have new training, it may require new funding. So it's very much an ongoing, and that goes back to what we said the very first week of class, right? Emergency management is at its essence continuous improvement. It's always learning from and being better to go forward. Questions, comments? Okie dokie. So Tuesday we have Newberry College's security chief come in to talk to us, and then we'll spend the rest of Tuesday and Thursday finishing up on Chapter 6. And if we have a little bit of time Thursday afternoon, we can do a bit of a review for the test. The test will be the following Tuesday. It'll be online. One change I am going to make is the open-endeds will not be included in the online test, because in grading it, it's just been much more confusing. It's taking much longer than it should. So that will be giving you a set of questions, and then just email me the responses. So they'll be set up as two separate assignments. One will be sections 1 and 2, which will be the matching and the fill in the blank, and those will be online to do. And then the other will be the essay part, which then there are the questions, you send them to me. Pretty exciting? Okay, questions, comments? Okay, well, have a good weekend. Do good things, make us proud, and we'll